Hello and welcome to Weekly 10's Powerful Question session. This is a session exploring the behavioural science and best practice of asking questions both inside Weekly 10 itself and more generally in the workplace and outside the workplace. A lot of what we cover here will probably feel like common sense. Some of the theory I talk about you will almost certainly already know, but hopefully along the way you'll pick up a few new bits and pieces that you can look to utilise when you're starting out with Weekly 10 and whenever you're next looking at employee feedback. The aim of this session really is to give you all an equal foundation on the theory behind asking effective questions at work, which lead to more effective interventions in and around what you do. I should say at this stage, hello again, and that my name is Chris. I head up our people science team here at Weekly 10. My personal background is in consumer communication and organizational psychology, having previously worked with brands such as TK Maxx, O2, Royal Bank of Scotland, and Toyota. And what me and the team here at Weekly 10 do is we work with our clients like yourselves on lots of consultation sessions and training sessions similar to this one. We also look at deep dives of data. If, let's say, the Weekly 10 data dashboard is telling you something, but you want to understand it a little bit more, then we can look to help you with that. We can also run things like ideation sessions when it comes to interventions that you can put in place at work. And we're accessible to you guys whenever you need via your customer success partner. So if you reach out to them, they can get us hooked up. We also work with our academic partners here in the UK on sort of testing out the theory and testing out new bits and pieces of the Weekly 10 platform. And internally, we work with our developers on pushing that roadmap forward and looking at what really is going to impact behaviour in terms of the new additions that we add to the platform. Jumping into the session itself, if you were to ask a doctor, a lawyer, or a journalist the importance of asking effective questions, they inherently know that the benefit there. Doctors understand that they need to work out what's wrong with the patient, and one of the best ways to do that is to ask. Lawyers need to understand the truth of the case. Journalists need to get to the bottom of the story, and the best way again to do that is to ask questions. If you look at doctors specifically here in the UK, the General Medical Council says if you want to offer an academic course in medicine, you actually have to, if you want to be GMC certified, you have to offer a module within that course about patient feedback specifically. But if we look at our managers in our workplaces, despite all the training they probably go through, it's very rare that they'd ever go through anything around how to ask their team members questions effectively, how to gather feedback effectively, how to really have impactful conversations with their teams. It's very, very rare at this stage. Some companies are doing it, most do not. But it's really important to understand how to ask a question well, because both anecdotally here at Weekly 10 and the theory would tell us that if you ask a question in a bad way or a negative way, you have lots of negative outcomes potentially. It could be confused respondents, it could be you're asking a question that has bias or that leads to a certain response. The one I really want to focus on here though is this one, leading to avoidance. So throughout this session, I will litter a few books here and there. These are sort of pop science books, which are very accessible, although I'll caveat by saying that this one isn't particularly accessible. This one's a little bit harder to read, but very accessible generally, and a really nice way to just pick up like a good overview of whatever it is that I'm talking about at that stage. So Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, it isn't just about avoidance, it's about all sorts of things to do with cognition and the ways in which we think and reach decisions as humans. Daniel Kahneman is a Nobel Prize winner. He's the first non-economics professional to win the Nobel Prize in economics. He is a behavioral scientist. You've almost probably certainly heard of this book. A few of you may have read it already. It's a really good read, but as I say, it's not quite as accessible as the others. And in it, he talks a little bit about avoidance. Now, what avoidance is our brain's way of protecting us from harm. And by harm, I don't mean just physical harm. I mean sort of just anything from feeling confused, angry, upset, jealous, to actual physical harm. And it happens in one of two ways. It's either usually conscious, and I always pick on my wife at this stage and give an example of conscious behaviour that she does, which is when we're watching television. If there's a scene in a program that perhaps focuses on surgery, she will very visibly either turn her head away or put her hands in front of her eyes or in some way avert her gaze from the screen because she doesn't like blood and gore and those sorts of things. So she'll very obviously in some way stop herself from seeing that. Now, that's a really conscious example of avoidance. Daniel Kahneman, in his book, talks a lot about subconscious. He talks about an example where he went to a restaurant, had a really nice meal, great wine, great conversation, but then realized he never went back. And the reason he hypothesized he never went back is the last thing that happened in that restaurant was a waiter dropped a glass of water down him. He got cold, he got wet, he got slightly annoyed by his own admission, and what his hypothesis was that that lasting event was tarnished by that fact that the water was dropped on him, and he created a number of negative connotations about that restaurant in his head off the back of that one event. Now it was he again he upon reflection he says that's unfair. But that is actually how our brain works. Our brain will see something negative that happened, and it will say, "Right, okay, you don't want to go back there. We're not going to think about that restaurant again." If we think about it in terms of work, we've all had reports land on our desk where we look at them and go, "Oh, I've done something like this before. They take ages to do. I don't really fancy doing it. I'm going to push it back a few days." If we then push that into the world of Weekly 10, we don't want people to be thinking, "Oh, for some reason there's negativity around this process, so I'm just going to push it back a day or two, my check-in." So it's really important that we understand that asking bad questions can lead to avoidance, and we need to look at ways in which to minimise that. Now, what about asking questions more generally? Well, in the 1970s, a couple of researchers from Duke University in the States looked at asking questions at a very general level to see what are the benefits. Why do we as humans ask questions of one another? And they found these two key reasons. They found reason one, it's all about information exchange. I want to know something I don't know already. Reason two, it's about impression management. I want to ask a question so that other people see me as intelligent or inquisitive or whatever it might be. In some way, we want to leave an impression. Now, if we think about the modern day world of HR, these two findings actually map quite well to two key areas of HR. So information exchange is all about employee feedback. What do our employees know? What do they live through? What are their experiences and their opinions? What do we need to know from them? And the other one, impression management, maps quite well. It's not a 100% match, but it maps quite well to the employee experience. We want to ask questions of our people, both to literally shape, the experience they're having, but also at a cognitive level to make them think that we're trying to shape the experience that they're having in one way or another. So bearing that in mind, the next question I always ask is, why are we here today? And what I'd ask right now is just for you to take a few seconds to think about, what are the reasons that you're listening to me talk to you today? Why is it that you started to look for a solution like Weekly 10? Why are you after employee feedback, really, I guess? Now, when I ask this question, normally I get a huge range of answers, some of which I'll pop up onto the screen now. And it can be anything from, it can be about productivity, it can be about performance, engagement, well-being. It can be things like, a bit more general, we want to improve our culture, or we want to drive innovation. You'll have your own reasons for working with Weekly 10 and looking at a solution like Weekly 10. But really, if I put on my behavioural science hat and I detach myself from the specific answer that is important to you, really what we're talking about is two things here, generally speaking. We're either going to be given an answer which is all around behaviours. We want people to do X more often, or we want people to do Y less often. Or we probably, and the arrow in a minute will be explained, the other one is attitudes. We want people to think in a certain way. We want people to feel a certain way about working here. Now, the arrow denotes what comes before. So behaviours, at a very basic level, behaviours are determined by attitudes. Attitudes are actually determined by a hidden third thing here, which actually your answer won't have really probably taken into account. But the third thing here is perception. Perceptions, the way the things that we see in the world and the way we experience the world shape the way we think about the world, our attitudes, and the way we think about the world shapes the way we act within the world. So the arrows here just sort of denote that flow. Now, this is essentially a principle called attitudinal consistency, and it suggests that people are rational. And it says, we see something, we think about something, we act in a certain way. Now that's a very rational model, and we know that human beings actually aren't that rational all the time. But we also know that the ways in which we act are very context-based. And when we look at the world of work, that is a very regimented sort of context. And actually, this principle of attitudinal consistency, where we see we think we do holds true the vast majority of the time. So we can put quite a lot of faith into this model when we're looking at employee feedback. If you're looking sort of further out in the world, if you're looking at sort of consumer research or other bits and pieces, then this model becomes potentially less effective. But within the world of work, this rings true really nicely. And to give you an example of what I mean here by this, if we're thinking about behaviors at the workplace, we might want our employees to say this to us. I'm going to work an extra hour tonight. Now, if our employees do say that to us, then what's behind that? What's the reason for that? Well, a reason might well be that they have the attitude that their manager really cares about them. And if they believe in reciprocity, people are good to me, so I'm good to other people, then that's a tangible link between those two things. But what leads to that attitude is the perception that they have. My manager is always asking me how I'm doing, so they're always asking me how I'm doing. Therefore, I think they care about me. Therefore, when they need me, I'm going to be there for them. Now, I've put values on the screen here because I just mentioned reciprocity. Values are essentially hardwired attitudes. These are the things that we grow up with and learn as we grow. These are things like stealing is wrong, stealing is right. Murder is wrong, murder is right. I believe in capital punishment. I don't believe in capital punishment. Free crime-based examples there for you. I'm not quite sure why they came to mind first, but read into that what you will. But values are really hard to change, and we have to accept that. Some people just will not think in the same way that we do. That values is something we can look at as a department. It's very hard to change. Really, values is something you need to be looking at your hiring stage, and sort of asking questions there and working out what really drives a person, what their motivators are. But we can we can look at them as well. But values do have an impact here as well. We have to have our hands up and say, look, values are something that we need to look at some stage. But based off of that relatively straightforward, simple model, at a behavioural level, again, with my science hat on, what a question for me should be doing is either creating and shaping some perceptions, measuring and shifting attitudes, or changing or actually hopefully reinforcing good behaviours. So that's really what I want questions to be doing. And then there's the hidden additional, the sort of the elephant in the room, because actually, as good as all of this is and shaping perceptions and changing attitudes and other bits and pieces, it might just be that for some reason we need employee feedback. So I'm going to play a short video for you now. It'll take a few seconds to load in, but I'll play that and we'll come back to it in a second. So hopefully you've got a video on screen now, and all you have to do is count how many passes the team in white make. Right, so hopefully if we're counting along we will have got 13. But the real test here is how many people watching this video right now saw the moonwalking bear. Now the video is going to rewind itself. If you want to, you can rewind this session just to check I wasn't cheating. This is the exact same video that you're watching now. And what we'll see coming in from the right hand side now is a bear doing a little, throwing a few shapes in the middle and now moonwalking off to the left. Now what this is a psychological phenomena called change blindness. If you haven't seen a video like this before, somewhere around about 70% of people will have missed that bear. If you have seen videos similar to this before, you are obviously slightly more likely to have seen that bear. But there are lots of examples of these sort of videos on YouTube that you can just grab after this session, and they show different things changing. And you test out your employees or your friends or whoever, and they will miss stuff, I promise you. Now, hopefully, a few of you on this call watching this session missed something on there. And what this really is, it's a really nice metaphor for our managers and what our managers have to be doing. So change blindness basically says that things within our visual field can be missed if they don't happen obviously enough. Now, we're all hopefully sat here just staring at a screen and missing things right in front of our eyes. Managers, they've got lots of people to look after. They have their own responsibilities in terms of their own work to do. They have all sorts of bits and pieces that are going to be distracting them from keeping an eye out on the team. If we think about the world of remote work, which obviously is very prevalent in now in today's modern society. That means that they can't actually necessarily see their people like they once could. They lost the ability perhaps to read the room and to look for social cues from their people. So if we're missing things sat here now looking at a screen right in front of our eyes, how much are our managers missing at any one time? And that's not a criticism of those people. It's not a criticism of our managers. It's just it's very hard for the human brain and perceptive systems to actually pick up on things. So the other thing, obviously, that questions need to do is give us that feedback, which alerts us to the good that's going on, the bad that's going on, the things that we need to pay more attention to that's going on, because we can't be there to see it all of the time. Moving on, I'm going to now jump into 6 golden rules that we have here at Weekly10 for powerful questions. Now, these are a jumping off point for all clients. All clients are different. We absolutely acknowledge that. What you want to get out of Weekly10 will be different to what another client will. The way in which your culture works will differ, but they're a really good jumping off point, these 6 golden rules. And it's all about maximizing respondent motivation, minimizing task difficulty, and hopefully leading to greater impact. So the way I always talk about it from an employee point of view, it's I want to do it, it's easy to do it, and it has great outcomes for me. And that's kind of what we want to always think about whenever we're writing any sort of question. This is what we want to help to shape. So, golden rule number 1. This is more a cultural way of thinking than it is a golden rule per se, but it's the idea that bad data is worse than no data. What we mean by this is, if you're getting incorrect answers or forced answers into your data stream, that's going to have a big impact. And what I talk about here is something that I like to term the Donald Rumsfeld uncertainty principle. So for those of you who had forgotten or are too young to remember, Donald Rumsfeld is a former Secretary of Defense for USA. He's not a psychologist, he's not a behaviorist, depending on your viewpoint, he's not even particularly a great man. But what he did do in history, what I always remember him for, is this famous answer to a question he gave during the middle of the Second Gulf War, in which he was asked the question about, what do we know about the war? And he gave a very interesting answer where he talked about things that we know about the world, so known knowns, things that we know we don't know about the world, so known unknowns, and things that we don't know that we don't know about the world, so unknown unknowns. Now, the journalists in the room at the time all looked a little bit like this. It was a very confusing answer, but actually there's quite a lot of sense in there when you can unpick the language. And really what we want to talk about is beware of these unknown unknowns. So known knowns, things that we know we know. If you're a HR team, if you're a business leader, the things that you know about your business and you can bank on, and you can utilize those in order to impact the way you do business. If there are things that you don't know about your business or about your employee base, you can plan. You can say, right, well, we don't know this yet, so we need to go out and find it. But if you're sat there assuming you know something that actually isn't true, you're wasting time, you're wasting money, you're wasting energy and effort, probably on interventions that aren't actually going to be all that useful. So we've really got to protect against these unknown unknowns. So what we talk about here, bad data being worse than no data. No data means that you have those known unknowns. We know there are things that we don't know, and we need to go out and plan. But if we've got bad data seeping into our data sets, then we could be led down the garden path and start investigating areas that actually aren't that impactful. So in principle, in terms of how you utilize Weekly10, the important things to think about here are how you set questions at a mandatory level. So within Weekly10, all questions are set to be not mandatory by default. Now you can turn mandatory status on for any question you want. But what happens is if you ask people to give you an answer to a question and you don't give them an option to say no, and they have to give you some sort of answer, you force their hand. Now, you would hope that if somebody had to give an answer to something they couldn't actually answer, they would write something along the lines of, I do not know. And that does happen, but we've also seen time and time again that people will actually just make things up. They will make answers up. They will exaggerate stories or truths, and they will actually write a paragraph about something that happened last week, which was so insignificant it took them 10 minutes to remember it anyway in the first place. And then actually they're now focused really heavily on this tiny little thing that wasn't actually at all important for them. And they're giving you lots of information about something that actually, if you were to go back and ask them in a week, they would have forgotten about it again. So it's really important to utilize a mandatory setting within Weekly10 sparingly. we would always urge you not to set every question as mandatory. You are paying money to utilize Weekly 10, and it's perfectly understandable that you'd like questions to be answered every week by every employee. But that's not the real world, sadly. There will be weeks where certain employees won't have an answer for a question. They won't have time to answer a question or to do their Weekly 10 potentially. They'll just choose not to answer a question for one reason or another, and that's okay. Yes, you want to probably intervene when that becomes a something that happens frequently with a certain person. You want your managers to intervene, absolutely. But yeah, you want to really, ideally, not to be utilising mandatory statuses too frequently. It's also important when you're utilizing rating scales to offer a middle ground, so a number or a response within a rating which says, I do not know, or I cannot answer this stage, so that people can just utilize that instead of forcing them to one side of an answer or the other, because again, it's just misleading data. Also related to golden rule number 1 is the idea of volume. So the little graphic here is just a humorous look at why volume is important, and we do believe that volume is key in any science. Good scientist will tell you that your sample size needs to be of a decent size in order to get really accurate conclusions. So if you're a team of 20, 30, 40, you might have to look at volume a bit more seriously than, say, a business of 2,000, where in a single week you might get 2,000 check-ins. You need to sort of balance that based on the specifics of your business. And what we always talk about here is looking at the trend analysis tools. So if an employee raises something within their check-in which is a clear red flag, then we absolutely want you to act upon it. But what we do say is don't act on every single piece of data that you get given within a check-in, because human beings, we're fickle people. Our answers to questions change based on the weather, based on the economy, based on what's going on in our private lives, based on if the vending machine just swallowed our money or not. Answers to questions change very easily for humans. So the way we answer something one week might be completely different to the way we answer it the second week, the third week, and the fourth week. So what Weekly 10 is really good at, and where it's at its best, from my point of view, is facilitating really good conversations between managers and employees. So if you see something in a check-in which is a red flag, absolutely act upon it. The first action, really, ideally, should always be a manager going to speak to that employee and say, hey, what's up? Tell me more about this. And then, understanding, is this a big issue, or is it just, the air conditioning unit was broken today, so people are in a slightly worse mood than they should be. Our trend analysis tools also help you look at that. They give you that sort of that macro level view of your data, so you can see over time how things are going. And yeah, if 2 weeks in a row or 2 check-ins in a row things are trending down, then it's more serious to act then than it was a week ago. So always bear in mind volume. And finally, with golden rule number 1, we talk about transparency. So again, hopefully another slightly humorous look at why transparency isn't always a good idea here. But actually, we at Weekly 10 are absolutely champions of transparency. We understand that for many businesses out there, anonymity is a key tool in any sort of engagement surveys you've done in the past, or any sort of feedback processes you've run through, because there's a thinking as human beings that if we ask people to be truthful with us, and we have a level of power over that person, so we are their boss, their manager, whatever, they might not be truthful if they have to own that feedback. But actually, when you go out and test it, that's not necessarily true. If transparency feels like a step too far for you guys, then fine. Anonymity is where you start, and we'll slowly try and chip away at that and introduce more transparency. But what we see time and time again is if you give people the ability to own the feedback they give you, it sometimes takes a few weeks or check-ins to happen. But what happens is people do start to have more accountability over that, and they do start to become more honest over time. Anonymity, really, it slows down conclusions because there's no way to confirm who said what and why they said it. Data could be, it could be inaccurate to true feelings that you've captured, and it just generally leads to less effective interventions because of that. It also doesn't empower managers to have those really effective one-to-one conversations with your people. If a manager doesn't know who said it, they can't go up and say, hey, person X, I saw this on your check-in, let's sit down and talk about it because I want to sort it out for you. So just like mandatory status, no questions within Weekly 10 by default are anonymous, but you can turn that on at a question level. So each question can become anonymous if chosen. There is a place for anonymity as well. As I say, that there's that cultural point. If you feel that you're just not quite in a place yet where people can be open and honest, then let us know. Let's turn on anonymity to begin with, and we have a number of different processes that we can introduce to try and coax out that more transparent and honest feedback. And also, if you're running something like an ENPS, so that's an Employee Net Promoter Score question, which for those of you who don't know, it's a simple question, rating 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend working here to a family member or friend? Now, unsurprisingly, if you ask that question openly, you get lots of 9s and 10s because it's a very obvious measure. Everybody understands what the real deal with that question is. There's no hidden agenda there. It's, if I score badly on this, my manager's going to come and say, "Oh, why have you only given us a 4?" But if you actually anonymize an ENPS, you'll find a much larger range of answers. You will get 1s, you will get 10s, and you'll get quite a lot in between. So there's always place for anonymity, but where possible, really push to be transparent and drive that open, honest feedback within Weekly 10. Golden rule number 2, this is all about reducing cognitive load and related to that relevancy as well. So the importance of relevancy, which I'll start with. So if you've got, let's say, a check-in with 5 questions, and these are all organizational questions, meaning all those questions will go to everyone within an organization, it's really important to make sure that each of those questions is actually relevant to everyone within that organization. So we've seen before with current clients that you might set a question which utilizes a piece of jargon, which is internal jargon for your company, that you actually believe to be universal across the business. But actually, what we found with one client in particular I'm thinking of is a piece of jargon that was asked wasn't actually relevant at all to a small team they had of traveling sales reps. It wasn't something that they understood or knew, and they found that this team had a really low response rate within Weekly 10. And when we did some investigation, one of the team members owned up and went, "Well, to be honest, I don't think it's very personal to me because they're asking me this question and I don't actually know what this thing means, and I just feel like it's perhaps something more for the office guys." And that's really important at a cognitive level. Human beings, we like to feel like we're involved and something's personal to us. So asking questions which aren't directly relevant to individual people is going to hamper your participation rate. So with that particular client I mentioned before, we changed their check-in. So we made this question with the jargon a departmental question. So that means we could select who it went to, which departments it went to, and we just took out this traveling sales team, put something different in for the traveling sales team, and their participation shot up to, I think, 3rd or 4th best in the company over a couple of weeks' time. So it's really important to look at relevancy. But then, as I said before, this is really more about cognitive load. So that is the ability and capacity of our brain to do things at any one time. So, looking at that in a bit more detail, there's this rather confusingly also a golden rule, but this is a golden rule within the world of psychology, the golden rule of 7 plus or minus 2. Now, 7 plus or minus 2 comes from research by a chap called Miller in the 1950s, who at the time was looking at memory, and then over 70 plus years since his research, that sort of golden rule has been tested in lots of other areas of cognition. And the important one here alongside memory for us is attention. And what's been found is 7 plus or minus 2, it rings true both in memory and attention. Our brain has a capacity limit. It's a muscle within the body, and it doesn't have an infinite resource just like any other muscle in our body. It can handle at any one time somewhere between 5 and 9 pieces of information before negative impacts start to happen, essentially. So if you're looking at it in terms of questions, if you're asking more than, say, 9 questions within any sort of process, what might start to happen is, you might start to see things like respondent fatigue creeping in. You might see future avoidance creeping in. So we talked about avoidance before, but if I look at a list and I've been asked to answer 50 questions, I go, this looks like a lot of work. This isn't something I really want to do now. It's going to eat into the time that I've got to do this other job. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to push it back, and I'm going to push it back, and I'm going to push it back. And actually now I'm not going to do it, and now I'm not going to do it. And what happens there? That avoidance behavior builds up. You might also see satisficing, which isn't a typo. It's the technical term essentially for making things up. So yeah, you might see people start to make up answers and just tick certain parts of the rating scale just because it's the thing on the right hand side, and that's where hand is, so I'm just going to tick on the right. It's people making things up. Now, what I should say here is 7 plus or minus 2, it isn't a cliff edge. If all of a sudden 1 week you put 10 or 11 questions into your check-in, you're not suddenly going to absolutely kill participation. But the further away you get from that 7 plus or minus 2, the more likely these behaviours, these negative behaviours are to creep in. Fewer questions also, we've done some tests with academic partners, specifically within Weekly 10, just to look at questions in Weekly 10, and we found ourselves that fewer questions in Weekly 10 leads to more attention being paid to the questions, so people really, A, read the questions, and B, if you ask them an hour later, they remember what questions they've been asked. And then they actually give you more detailed answers as well, the fewer questions you give. It makes sense because we all like to do things that are easy, and if we don't have to answer too much, we're more keen to answer correctly. Golden rule number 3, this is all about variety. So what I talk about here with variety is question type, and more specifically actually data type. So this is common sense, and I'm sure you all know it, but there are 2 types of data that we're really talking about here. And that's quantitative, which to simplify it down is numbers, and qualitative, which to simplify it down is words. Now there's a behavioural economic professional working at Ogilvy called Rory Sutherland. You may have heard of him. He's done lots of interesting TED Talks. He's had a podcast series on Radio 4 recently. And what Rory Sutherland says is quantitative data shows you where things are at. Qualitative tells you the why. Your numbers tell you what's happening, but the words tell you why they're happening. And we really sort of lean into that ethos here at Weekly 10. We really think that qualitative data has a real important role to play. It's qualitative data is something that's historically been a lot harder to analyse, so people have shied away from it. But it's something that we really want to encourage within Weekly 10. So looking at that in a bit more detail, quantitative data really is all about closed-ended questions. So things like rating style questions, multiple choice style questions, dichotomous questions, so that's your yes, no, true, false style questions. And absolutely you have full access to those sort of questions in Weekly 10. The really nice thing about closed questions and quantitative data more specifically is, one, from an employee point of view, they're really easy to do. They're almost like a little cognitive break. When you're in the middle of typing out long answers, just being able to not think too much and give someone a score between 1 and 5 is that little cognitive break, which is really beneficial. From a employer point of view, from a HR point of view, a leadership point of view, numbers are great because they're easy to report and they give us a real clear measure of where something's at. It's a nice number. We all know numbers. You don't have to do too much sleuthing to understand what that number means. So they're really good. But the qualitative is where the real data lies. So within Weekly 10, we have things like text box answers, with that single line text, multi-line text. We have our recognition questions where people can recognize the great work of others around them, and hopefully give more commentary on why they're being recognized. And we also have our comments boxes. So any closed question, any question looking at quantitative data can have a comments box turned on for it, so that if people want to, they can give you more written data, and we'd actively encourage that as much as possible, that you utilize the comments boxes. They are off by default on questions, but you can turn them on as and when you wish. And thinking about that whole, the qualitative tells you the why, the quantitative tells you what's going on. If we look at the outputs from these sort of questions, if we look at the quantitative, that's really good at measuring external attitudes. So I talked earlier about attitudes, and we have, generally speaking, 2 types of attitudes. We have external and we have internal. Our external is what we tell the world. We tell the world we vote a certain way. We tell the world we think a certain way about controversial laws. We think a certain way about trash TV shows. I would say I never watched Love Island. Now, my internal attitude, actually, that's something completely different potentially. It might be the same, but quite often within humans, it's not. So it's actually, I told you I vote a certain way, but actually I don't. I vote this way. I told you I feel a certain way about a law that's coming up, but actually I don't. I feel this way. I told you I don't watch Love Island, but actually I do. It's that sort of weighing up the differences there between the internal and the external. For one reason or another, we like to hide certain bits of information away about ourselves. Now, that quantitative data is really good at the external. It's like an EMPS. It's very obvious what you're asking me when you're asking me to give you a number for something. So I'm going to be able to game that slightly. I'm going to be able to play that game a little bit and say, well, actually, I don't want to seem 2x or 2y, so I'm going to put a number of this. And that's really good because, it can give us a number, which is a nice measure, but we just have to bear in mind that it's a lot easier for individuals to game that. So the qualitative data and those sort of open-ended questions, they look a lot more at the internal. So our Tempos, for example, our AI engagements score, that's driven by the words that people write. And although humans are brilliant when it comes to language, we can often be betrayed by the words in which we use and the context in which they're used, because we don't always necessarily write exactly what we mean. And sentiment analysis, which is part of the AI platform we use here at Weekly10, is really good on picking that up. It looks at how people use words, the context in which they're used, and basically it makes a decision on, is this as positive as this person is trying to make it sound, or actually are there markers here, are there things here within the words that actually tell a different story. And it gives us a much clearer view on the internal attitude of that person. And sort of measuring those two together, external and internal, is sort of the acid test really, and seeing like, do these things match up and do they not. So it's really important from our point of view that you're asking as many qualitative questions as possible, just to really make sure we're getting that internal attitude measured correctly. So what the arrows denote here is sort of, yes, we do see a benefit to quantitative, and we would absolutely urge you to utilize a few quantitative questions now and then, but very much our focus is on the qualitative side of things, and that's what the whole platform has been built for, really. Golden rule number 4 is all about consistency, and this is consistency in 3 key ways. So key way number 1 that we have to be consistent is the frequency of our check-ins, and I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail in a minute, but if you decide you're going to do a weekly check-in, great. Bi-weekly, great. Monthly, great. That's fine, whatever works for you. But what's important is making sure you continue to utilize that check-in at that cadence. Now, it's very difficult by default within Weekly10 to not be able to push out a check-in, but if you were to turn off all your questions, for example, it might be possible that a check-in wouldn't go out. So whatever you settle on, make sure you've always got questions that are there, ready to go, that are turned on, and that those check-ins are going. I'll talk about a little bit more detail in why in a second. The second area for consistency is around core questions. So again, I'll go into a bit more detail in a minute or two, but core questions are the questions that you ask every check-in. And these are sort of based around some of the real key theory, the key cornerstones of employee engagement and performance. And these are questions that we think people should be able to answer each and every week. Now, you have the ability to create whatever core questions you want. We will obviously give you a helping hand to get started and say this is what we think works really well, but we'll tinker with that over time. But once you have those questions that you want to be asking each and every week, you have to make sure you do ask them each and every week or check in, just because they need to be there in order for people to be able to answer them. And then the third area for consistency is all around scale direction. So I must apologise because this, hopefully so far you've been enjoying this session, but this is a very dry slide, and I do apologise. Now this is an example of what we call a 5-point Likert scale style question. So Likert scales are essentially things that run between 1 to 5, 1 to 7, or things like strongly agree, strongly disagree. And 5-point just means there's 5 answers. Now this is from a textbook, it's not from Weekly10. But what we can see here is we have section 1 and section 2. In section 1, we have the standard statuses that we need to tick and respond to. Same with section 2. And running across at the top of section 1, we have our options. These go from strongly agree on the right to strongly disagree and no response on the right. Section 2 reverses that order. So section 2, we can see that strongly disagree is on the left, but strongly agree now is on the right. So they've switched positions. Now this is a big no-no, really. For a number of reasons, but the key reason being that humans are by nature somewhat lazy. We utilize something called behavioral heuristics in anything that we do, and a behavioral heuristic is a cognitive rule of thumb, really, things that we've learned over time to help us quickly get through tasks. It's we don't check our mirrors as much once we've passed our driving tests as we used to, because it just saves us time. It's a little bit less energy efficient. It's a bit more energy efficient not to worry about it quite as much. Our behaviors behind the wheel change. Our behaviors and everything change the more frequently we do these things. So thinking about one heuristic in particular here, the familiarity heuristic, what could be happening, and almost certainly is happening, is me as a really studious respondent to this survey. I'm looking at it and I'm taking real good care and attention at section 1. I'm looking at section 1. I'm understanding that strongly agrees my first option, agrees the second, disagree, strongly disagree, no response. Great, I've taken that all in. When I get to section 2, I'm less likely to look at that top line because I'm just going to assume that it follows the same as it did before. So what happens is I'm reading the statuses, I'm reading the phrases perfectly well. I'm satisfied with X. I found the content to be useful. I'll pay attention to that because I know intrinsically that they change. But I'm not going to look at that top line. I'm just going to assume that rating scale is the same. So what's happening is I could be giving you bad data here by completely accident because I'm just assuming, making the assumption that things follow suit. So where I'm ticking strongly disagree, I actually might strongly agree. So if and when you're utilizing rating scale questions within the same check-in, keep your directions the same throughout, because otherwise you are just going to get some bad data creeping into your data set. Golden rule number 5. So I talked about frequency before, but really at the heart of Weekly 10, what we're looking at is habit. We're trying to create a habit of giving and sharing open, honest feedback within a workplace. Creating lines of communication between managers and teams and leaders, and just creating a culture of trust, really, and feedback. Key to building habits are frequency and simplicity. So I talked about frequency before. Whether you're doing it weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, whatever it is, your cadence for check-ins, that frequency is really key. So Nerial, you again may well have heard of him. He's an American author, lecturer, investor. He's not a behavioral scientist, but he very much has behavioral science at the heart of everything he does as a businessman. He's written a number of books. Hooked is by far my favourite, and it's very much about sort of habit forming processes, and he talks more specifically in terms of products that he's helped build or consult on. And in the book, he sort of talks about habits are really hard to break. If you think about your New Year's resolution habit, but if you're anything like me, by about mid-January, that's gone out the window. But actually, adopting new habits is quite simple if you just really heavily focus on frequency. So he looks at examples from the world of sort of dental care, so flossing, healthy eating, specifically a study he did in and around email management. And he talks about the importance of frequency in all of those situations. The more frequently we can do something, the better we become at it, and the more intrinsically linked it is to what we are and what we do. And that's how our habit forms, really. Now, related to this point of frequency, 96% of managers, it sounds like common sense, but Gallup tell us that 96% of managers say that they are less anxious and better at giving feedback the more they do it. So it's that old adage of practice makes perfect. And from the world of educational psychology, there's been lots of studies that show that there's an effectiveness limit to feedback. And in a teacher-student setting, that diminishes with time. And a lot of the studies point to about a 72-hour window. So after an event has happened, feedback given within a 72-hour window is at its most effective. Once you start to move away from that 72-hour window, it becomes less effective because the student forgets what they did, or why they did it, or the way they did it, or how they were feeling when they did it, or all sorts of other bits and pieces. Things start to diminish in our memory, and therefore the feedback is less applicable. Now, again, like 7 plus or minus 2, it's not a cliff edge. You don't suddenly get to 73 hours and all of a sudden feedback is ineffective. But the further away you get from 72 hours, the more likely it is that feedback is going to be less effective. So that's why we're called Weekly 10. We think feedback should be given weekly. We will. I'm sure your customer success rep will have already talked to you about, we really would like you to be doing this weekly. That's where we see the most benefit, when both anecdotally and when we test it with our academic partners, a weekly check-in is the most effective. We don't say do it every 72 hours because that's just too hard to manage. You don't want your managers having to give rounds of feedback every 72 hours when they've got their own work to focus on. It would also mean that they'd have to give feedback on Saturdays and Sundays. So weekly's the sort of a nice balance between the art and the science, really. So that's why we're called Weekly 10. And then the 10 bit really is about simplicity. It is only meant to be a 10-minute process here. It's meant to be nice and easy for people to very quickly share feedback, even quicker for managers to then review that feedback, and keep everything as simple as possible to really strengthen the likelihood that a habit forms. Some tips here really on the screen at the moment. I won't go through them all, but I talked about jargon before, making sure it's universal, so make sure that's true. Keeping language simple for all levels of comprehension, and then I've corrected myself and used the word understanding because comprehension is more of a complex word. So keep language simple. Now this comes from a 2006 organizational psychology study looking at 2,000 professional working adults in the UK. There's a statistic that came out of it was a big study where they asked all sorts of different questions on all sorts of different topics, but one of those topics was comprehension. And there's a great statistic from their comprehension element of the study, which showed that 3% of UK professional adults couldn't agree strongly or slightly with the statement that 50% off is the same as half price. 50% off is the same as half price. Now, that to me sounds like a very simple statement. I can very happily agree with that statement. 50% is about as easy a percentage as you're going to have to work with after 0 and 100. Half price means 50% to me. Those two things are perfectly easy for me to understand. And I would assume that everyone within Weekly 10 who I work with would also understand them, because I think, well, these guys are of a similar level of education to me. They work in the same environment as me. I get along with these people. And what we do when we think people are similar to us is we overcompensate for their abilities. We presume that they are as good at something as we are. This statistic shows that that's not quite true. If 3% of UK working adults can't agree with a relatively simple statement, then what that's showing us is that 50% isn't as easy for everyone else as it is for me, perhaps. And that's the same with language. So we need to make sure that our language is as simple as possible for everyone to understand. Checking for biased or leading questions. So we have a question bank here at Weekly 10. Now, this question bank contains lots and lots of questions which have gone to our academic partners, and those academic partners have run efficacy testing on those questions. This means they screen them for things like biases or leading elements or discriminatory language or all sorts of other bits and pieces, and they've given them the seal of approval and said, yeah, these questions are really good. They don't have any of this stuff in them. So if you need some inspiration and you want some unbiased questions, then you can come to us and we can utilize the question bank. Equally, if you have some questions that you want to utilize yourself, you're more than welcome to send them into the people science team here, and we're pretty good these days at spotting, biases, leading questions. It might even be that we even pass them on to our academic partners for a review, but we can certainly help you out if needs be. And the last one to really talk about here, because I've mentioned the other two already, but don't write double-barrel questions. This is something we see quite often, very often actually with rating style questions. So you might have a question which is something along the lines of, how would you rate the culture and friendliness of this company to work for? Now, you would hope that friendliness and culture are positively correlated, and they often are, but they will not be for everyone. So if I am an employee that doesn't think they're correlated and I can't give you one answer for those, if I've only got the option to give you one number, that creates confusion for me. It might even create annoyance for me, which will lead to avoidance behaviors. It might be that you force me into giving you some bad data because actually I'm going to give you a 4, but actually I would say that the culture's a 5, but the friendliness is a 3. So I'm going to split it down the middle. So make sure that every question you ask in Weekly 10 is only focused on one area of the employee experience. The last rule now, showing outcomes. So Weekly 10 is really powerful. It's really good at helping shape culture and driving engagement and helping performance along. But it's at its most powerful when employees understand why they're doing it. It's not just about those buzzwords that we use as leaders and HR reps. It's the real impact for me as an individual. What is the real impact? So what we talk about here with outcomes is really what motivates humans and the impact that emotion has on the whole process. So starting with motivation, Dan Pink, very well-known business sort of author and semi-psychologist, he wrote a book all about human motivation a few years ago, more than a few years ago now, Drive, and it's, again, really good read. But in it, he talks about keys to human motivation. And this is a fairly basic model of motivation, but the 3 keys he talks about are autonomy, so our power to be in control of what we do, mastery, our power to be good at what we do, and purpose, our power to understand, why we do what we do. Now, if you look at more complex motivational theories, things like self-determination theory, you'll say that autonomy rings true there. In other motivational theories, you'll see autonomy and purpose are there. Mastery sort of falls in and out quite a bit, but autonomy and purpose are very consistently in lots of different motivational theories. So they're really important. Whatever motivational theory we sign up to, they're really important things. And autonomy and purpose really require knowledge of outcomes in order to be effective motivators. I can be in control of what I'm doing. I can be autonomous, but if I don't know what it leads to, then that autonomy is weakened. I can't really understand purpose unless I know what the outcome is of something. I can't really see, why am I doing this? I don't know. So that purpose is diminished. So we really need to link outcomes from feedback and the weekly 10 process to actually changes that are going on in and around the business. It's not necessarily good enough in the employee's eye just to go, oh, this is going to help us be more engaged, it's going to help us be better performers. I actually need something tangible to see what the outcome is. So within Weekly 10, we have certain outcome triggers anyway. So things like the manager review, sorry. If a manager reviews a check-in, then straight away that's an outcome from an employee because they're getting feedback back from their manager, which they perhaps weren't getting anyway. So that's a really nice, very simple, organic sort of outcome. Things like the recognition feed as well. If someone recognizes you within Weekly 10, that's an outcome. People around you, your peers are saying you do a great job, and this is why you do a great job. You get a little notification, you get a little mark in your Weekly 10 profile which says you've been recognized. There's lots of little bits and pieces, but it's always about, with clients, thinking what else can you guys do outside of Weekly 10 but link to Weekly 10. Do you have intranet boards where you could talk about Weekly 10? Do you have weekly stand-ups where you can maybe dedicate one stand-up a month to this is what you told us in Weekly 10, this is what we're doing in Weekly 10, and all sorts of other bits and pieces. I'll give you a few more examples in a second, because what I now want to talk about is that emotion as well. So by far my favourite behavioural psychologist, Dan Ariely. If you're going to read any book, I'd really highly recommend this one. It's fantastic for a lot of reasons, but I won't spoil them. But it's a really nice overview of lots of science and studies about why we do what we do as human beings. And Dan himself has got a really interesting backstory, so well worth checking out. He also does lots of interesting TED Talks. But what Dan says is the more involved we become in creating something or shaping something, the more emotionally attached we become to it. And the more emotionally attached we become to that thing, the more we start to give value to it, the more it drives our passion for it, the more committed we are to it. But we need to know we're building whatever that thing is. And if we don't know that we're building something, then it's not going to have an impact. So if we think about this in terms of what work, we're talking about building a culture, building a place where people want to work. Well, by osmosis, and yes, people might start to see that their culture is changing, but it'd be a lot quicker and a lot more obvious if we're telling them how it's changing and showing them. Now, what Dan does here, what he calls this whole process, is really the IKEA effect. So this is off the back of a study he's done within his book, where he's asked loads of people a group of people to build some IKEA furniture, and he's given another group of people some IKEA furniture that's pre-built, and he says to these people, right, sell your furniture to one another. And what he finds is the guys that had to build the IKEA furniture, the guys that actually had to put something into it before they saw the outcome, they will ask for more money per piece of furniture. They'll be less likely to let that furniture go. They'll feel sad when they have to let it go. They just build that emotional attachment. He's then done things with Lego and all sorts of other bits and pieces in the book. And more recently, this is still about 10 years old, I think, this TED Talk now, but more recently he's been working with the likes of IBM, Twitter, Uber, Spotify, I think, and applying this sort of very basic sort of study to the world of work and the way in which culture works. So he does this great 20-minute talk here on TED, what makes us feel good about work. Well worth checking out. As I say, it's only 20 minutes and it's full of really useful science. So again, this is what emotional elements can we build into our outcomes? How can we talk about outcomes in an emotional way? And the one I always talk about here is one of our clients does this brilliantly. So their CEO, this is a company of about 500, so people don't see the CEO very often. Their CEO once a month will go into their Weekly 10 recognition feed and see who's been recognizing who for what. And he'll pick 3, 4, 5 people, and he'll pick up the phone, or he'll write a letter, or he'll go and see them and say, great work, well done, I've read this about you, brilliant. Now, the sense of pride that gives someone, the sense of being seen that gives someone, just the all-round general positivity that gives an individual that their CEO has made the effort to pick up the phone or come and see them or whatever it is huge. And that's a really great sort of example of not a lot of effort and virtually no cost that you can add to the Weekly 10 process to really drive it. And so a lot of Weekly 10 is built within the platform and works within the platform, but there's added value that can come in from what you guys do at an internal comms level. Okay, so the last few slides now. What questions should we be asking? That'll be probably the burning question on a lot of people's lips on this session. So let's just have a quick review. How many questions should we ask? Well, 7 plus or minus 2. Let's keep that in mind. Now that relates to everything within the check-in. That's 7 plus or minus 2. So that's your questions that are organizational, departmental, team, and individual levels. And it's also, if you're using Momentum, our sort of performance tools, it's also your goals and OKRs. So typically speaking, how we'd break that down is usually somewhere between 5 and 7 questions and somewhere between 2 and 4 goals or OKRs. Now, obviously, if you're not using goals or OKRs, you'll have between 5 and 9 questions. So just whatever really best fits, but that's the general breakdown that we typically would suggest. When it comes to Tempulse, I mentioned Tempulse earlier, that's our employee engagement metric. Tempulse is an algorithm which is looking for certain things within your check-in. It's looking for a question about positives, it's looking for a question about negatives, and it's looking for a question about recognition. If one of those 3 things is missing, then Tempulse is less effective and less accurate. Tempulse also requires 10 check-ins worth of learning before it becomes its most accurate. So you'll have it pretty much from day one, but it learns to become more accurate over time. It is an AI which is learning. If you don't have a positive, negative, or recognition question in there, then Tempulse is probably less likely to be something you can use or you should be using. So if you want to use Tempulse, if you want to get that employee engagement metric score, you probably need a question about positives, negatives, and recognition. In terms of question variety, so I talked earlier about core questions. These are the things that should be asked every check-in. Now, unsurprisingly here, the white icons denote those 3 previous positive, negative, recognition style questions. So we think that they should be core questions, something about what's gone well this week, or what successes have you had, something about challenges or negatives, something about who's doing great work around you. Then the grey option on core questions, that's your optional. You can drop that in if you want, or you can drop the optional in on the one below on flexible. Your flexible questions are things that drop in and out. So this might be something that you ask every month, it might be something you ask every other check-in, it might be something you ask once a year. It can be really pertinent stuff around well-being, around remote working practices, around culture, or it can be really flippant stuff. It can be, who do you want to do the Christmas disco this year? Do you want Dodgy Dave's Disco, or do you want a Boney M tribute band? It can be whatever you want it to be. Those flippant questions are sometimes really nice to throw in every now and then as well, because it builds a bit more character, and it just sort of talks about more about who you are as a business and what your culture's like. But it's really about what's relevant to the business this check-in. What do we need to know? And that's what the flexible questions are there for. Again, so you'd have somewhere between 3 or 4 questions, 3 or 4 core questions and 3 or 4 flexible questions if you're trying to hit no more than 7 in total. And finally, just potential questions. So I said before, we have a question bank, which you're more than welcome to use. But here's an example of some of the questions that we utilize. So core questions I've talked about: positive, negative, recognition. So here we have, what have you achieved this week as our positive? What challenges have you faced this week as our negative? And our recognition piece is, has anyone done a great job this week? There are different ways to ask these questions, so you don't have to use that phrasing specifically. The question bank will have lots of different variations of these questions, so you can play around with phrasing if you want. Now below that we have core flexi questions. So these are what used to be flexible questions, and now these are things actually which we more often than not say, this might be a really good core question for you to start with. So the 2 core flexi questions we have are around development. Is there any support you need? And that can be support, or it could be, is there any training you need, or is there any equipment you need? And then one-to-ones. Is there anything you'd like to add to the agenda for the upcoming one-to-one we have? The reason these are now moving more into core territory, they're not fully core, they're core flexi. The reason they're moving more into that core territory is because we see huge benefits to asking these questions. I was talking before about showing outcomes. Straight away as a respondent to either of these questions, I understand the outcomes. If it's a development question, if I ask for something, hopefully I'm going to get it. If it's a one-to-one question about changing the agenda, well, that's a really powerful question, because that's not something that gets asked a lot. It's often that when you have a one-to-one or a sit-down with your manager, you don't know what the agenda is until you're in the room. So actually asking people to help shape those conversations is really powerful from an autonomy point of view, and from a emotional point of view, and from a just, I feel like I'm involved, I feel like I'm being listened to. My employee voice is so much more strengthened now because I'm being asked to dictate or to at least shape what's happening in our conversations, and that's really powerful. So we see really high response rates with these sort of questions, so they're really good to sort of launch with on Weekly 10. And then flexible questions. So these are just a few that I've picked from the question bank, but cultural, EMPS, opportunity-based ratings. As I said before, it could be about Christmas parties or summer parties. We have some clients that use a suggestion box here, or award nominations here. It can be whatever you want it to be with flexible. And like I say, the question bank will help you out there. So that's a sort of whistle-stop tour of some of the psychology behind asking questions, our top tips, and some more practical advice for Weekly 10 itself in terms of the questions you ask. That's it for this session. Hopefully you've really enjoyed it. If you have any questions for the session, then either we'll be running a Q&A off the back of this, or you're more than welcome to reach out to your customer success partner if that live Q&A isn't happening today. If you do need any help with anything that we've discussed today, then my email address is chris@weekly10.com, and you're more than welcome to drop me an email at any time. Hopefully you found the session useful. If you want to drop me an email and give me some feedback, whether that's positive or negative, then please do. If you've got any suggestions for changes, or if you just want to ask me more questions about why I love Dan Ariely so much, then by all means, you can do. But that's it for today, folks. So thank you very much for turning up, for listening, and I'll speak to you soon, hopefully. Thanks. Bye.